Welcome to BioIT World's Trends from the Trenches podcast, your insider's look at the science, technology, and executive trends driving the life sciences. I'm Allison Proffitt, editor of BioIT World, and this episode is hosted by Stan Gloss, founder of BioTeam, a life sciences IT consulting company at the intersection of science, data, and technology. Joining Stan today is Victoria Gamerman, Head of Data Governance and Insights at Boehringer Ingelheim Pharmaceuticals. Victoria gives her own perspective on the power and possibility of real-world data. Let's listen in.
Victoria, thank you so much for joining me today on my podcast. I've really been looking forward to it. I've been a big fan. I've seen you speak at least 2 times at BioIT World, and each one of those presentations, I was so impressed. So I couldn't wait to have you as one of my guests on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Stan. It's been a pleasure to get to know you over the years, and I look forward to a really great conversation today.
Now, before we kick it off, I think you have a message that you have to let us know about.
Yes. So I am a full-time employee at Boehringer. And so a quick disclaimer here. So this is an external activity that is entirely unrelated to my full-time employment with my employer, BI. And all of the statements that I make reflect my own views and experiences and are not attributable to BI, nor have I been authorized, of course, to speak on behalf of BI. So really looking forward to sharing my personal views and opinions today.
That's wonderful. And tell us a little bit about you and your background so everybody can know where you're coming from.
So I'm currently the global head of data governance and insights at BI. And in this role, I'm accountable to shape the data strategy and our data governance for our clinical development and our operations. Prior to that, I was the head of health informatics and analytics, where we established the strategic priorities based on needs from medical and commercial stakeholders. And I led this team of incredible data scientists who executed a variety of use cases to generate evidence from external clinical data and real-world healthcare data sources in support of drug development. So really a great alignment across the portfolio of a variety of different internal and external data sources. Formally, I'm trained with a PhD and a master's in biostatistics from the University of Pennsylvania's School of Medicine. And prior to that, I have both a bachelor's and a master's in mathematics from Boston University. And I've always really loved math because my grandmother was actually the first mathematician I ever knew. She was a math teacher for many, many years and instilled in me also this passion and desire, almost this pedagogue nature to empower colleagues and those around me to love and have a level of comfort with mathematics and with data and with analytics. So I also am an adjunct professor at Columbia University, a scholar professor that really focuses on applied analytics. So really trying to make sure that this future generation is also aware of the context of the data that we have and how to use it appropriately.
That's an amazing background. And I just love that story about your grandmother. Anyhow, so maybe for people who don't know about what real world data is, maybe you could just a little background of what that is in a in a pharmaceutical company, obviously.
Yeah, there's some really good existing definitions that I would recommend the audience to take a look at from a variety of data, a variety of sources. The FDA especially has been here in the US really proactive in providing some definitions. A very simplistic way that I could describe real world data within this healthcare setting is data that is collected during standard of care, during our day-to-day lives. This person generated health data, maybe from your Apple Watch or other connected devices, data from insurance, medical insurance claims that are made that track just your standard of care visits that happen, or from electronic medical records. But the interesting part about this is we have to remember that all of that data that's being collected, being generated, at least initially, was not intended for the purposes of research. And so this, as you can imagine, will bring up certain challenges depending on how we want to use the data. And I would distinguish that from real-world data that is collected with a specific intent or fit for a specific purpose. So a good example of that might be a disease-specific registry, a patient registry around people who have been diagnosed with a particular disease that collects them on their just standard of care journey, but standard of care for them with their conditions. So there's a variety of such real-world data sources.
Would UK Biobank be considered a real-world data source?
It could certainly be. I think it depends on how that data was collected, and that varies actually a lot from country to country and different rules and regulations. If in some countries, if a patient has additional samples of, for example, blood collected during a traditional visit, and then they choose to donate that sample, that would be considered non-interventional. In other situations, in other countries, because it is invasive, right? You're collecting a sample from a patient in that way, it could be considered interventional. So it really depends on the regulations.
So why is real-world data so important in the drug discovery process?
This is such a great question, and it's evolving actually in its importance. There has been a evolution we have seen also with how regulators like the FDA have taken to this kind of data. Historically, what I have seen and observed in terms of industry trends and trends from our regulators is a big lean into a culture of data collected for a very specific purpose, and therefore the design of a clinical trial to be very specific to address the scientific question at hand. Basically having maybe two cohorts in a very simplistic design where they differ solely based on treatment and are otherwise very, very much the same. And there have been, of course, challenges with the generalizability of the results of clinical trials in certain areas where differences are later seen. It doesn't apply to all products and compounds, but that has been a common criticism that I've heard over the years of clinical trial work. And ultimately, we all people are looking at and going into our pharmacy or going into our doctor's office, and I would ask my doctor, right, based on whatever was my condition, what is an appropriate medicine for me? And so there's this shift that I have observed of more towards personalized medicine that also leans on and connects to public health and this idea of what we can understand about a cohort or group of people who have, for example, a particular condition. We've also seen an evolution in our computing capability, technology, the ability to connect data in a way that we haven't before. And I think that has also, in my observation, been a big catalyst to be able to evolve the thinking of the real impact that real world data can have.
Oh, that's great. So what's, if what do you think the struggles are in the industry? Because you talked about lots of different data sources, both locally and internationally, and bringing things together. What are the struggles that you think the industry is having integrating and ingesting and using real world data?
There are so many, you may have to stop me because of the challenges.
We can stick with, we can stick with the major ones.
Yeah. So a few things that are top of mind with regards to challenges. First of all, real world data is collected within the real world environment of the people who are living with that disease. So naturally, if you think about drug development, which often has an international component to it, the experience of people living with disease varies from country to country because there are different best practices, different guidelines that are followed for the treatment of different diseases, different standard of care medications and practices that are available. So as we think about understanding these patient groups or in cohorts, we need to really understand the local standard of care and the local guidelines around that. That also includes the ability to access and purchase, for example, that data locally, the ability to subsequently analyze that data, which might vary from country to country. If you're in one country, you may not be able to access data that's collected in another country, even if it is real world data. So there's a lot of geographic limitations that come both from the collection all the way through to the analysis and interpretation of real world data, even though you may be studying a single cohort of people with a particular state of a disease. So that is one thing that comes to mind. And so as a result of that, you may, for example, work with different organizations, companies, vendors who are collecting data for the cohort of people or patients that you're interested in across, say, different countries. And what I have observed in my experience is that oftentimes different companies collect data in their own native format. So it's really been over the more recent years that organizations like Odyssey, who have come up with the OMOP common data model, have started to gain much more traction in order to be able to think about again, common data model that allows us to understand how interoperable these different data sources are and what can we compare and integrate and what we can't or even shouldn't in certain cases integrate.
Well, you can imagine that, if you have in the United States, our medical records have ICD-9 codes. Mm-hmm. Different countries don't have any thought of that. So trying to bring in and have an international cohort of patients, that must require a significant amount of effort to harmonize data across the globe in a global position.
That's a great observation, and that has also been my experience.
So that is another major struggle, is the harmonization of the data. This information is used for maybe building clinical trials? Or what do we use that kind of data for?
There are many uses for real world data that I think are being unlocked as we speak. First, to understand a group of people who are diagnosed with a disease, and a common term for that is a patient journey. Right. So you could think about some diagnosis as a pivotal or index event, and thinking about what happens with that person before they receive that diagnosis, and then what happens with that person and their interactions with their local healthcare system after they get diagnosed with that specific condition or disease. Mm-hmm. And so this idea of understanding a patient's journey really allows me to think more clearly about what are the problems that they face either with the healthcare system that they're interacting with, what are the challenges that they experience with how they treat their disease, and also being a bit more patient-centric and person-focused when I think about drug development, really, how we can make these compounds more related to things like precision medicine. If you can combine the real world data that we have on a person like me with the genotypic information, like you mentioned, a biobank, right, with my or a person like me, right, with the genetic or omic data, and we collect some specific information. I collect some specific information on a clinical trial because I choose to participate in a clinical trial. That trifecta of information ultimately that comes out of those data sources is what will give us a huge opportunity to better understand and create much really powerful medicines for the future generations.
Okay. So going forward, what solutions, what are people doing to harness what are the solutions that are being used to harness the information from, real world data? What are people doing there?
A reasonable and very common starting point that I have seen is to actually start with a single data source or single data asset. So you can imagine identifying, for example, a particular disease that is of interest and bringing in a data source that has information on people with that disease. Maybe it's a particular electronic medical record vendor, and they are selling a portion of their data. And so bringing that in-house, finding a place to stage that data, digging in with developing some subject matter experts who can really dig into understanding that data, which might also mean you have to have people who understand that environment in which the data was collected, as well as some domain or disease state knowledge around that, and really digging into what kind of data we have. And where I feel this is even more successful is also starting with a really good scientific question that we want to answer. That this data could, for example, give us better line of sight. Sometimes what we find is maybe the data quality is not there for a particular disease. Let's say it's a bit more rare. You don't have enough participants or enough people who have that disease to be able to have the right level of insight. But when we start with that scientific question and combine it with a well understood data source, that's really when you're able to harness the power of that single data source. And I'm still interested to learn more about and learn more from others around where they are looking to make those different data sets or different data assets interoperable. But in my experience, where organizations are really currently excelling is in the deeper understanding of a single data source.
So Victoria, thanks so much. That's a great answer. So I'd like to kind of pivot over to the demand for this kind of data and the impact it has on the people who actually have to work with this kind of data. Is there any angst, or do people have any anxiety or, implementing this kind of data in an organization?
So as someone who's worked with this kind of data, there is a level of assessment of the quality of the data that you get that needs to happen. I've always done due diligence on the data before really rolling it out to any key stakeholders. And this is where this combination of understanding the data at hand, the context in which it's collected, as well as having an important and valuable business question you're trying to answer really comes into play. It's one thing to have a data asset or a data product that's there ready to go and sitting and waiting. It's another to be able to bring along key stakeholders who have questions, and the data asset you have could potentially provide a level of insight to those questions. So there is a bridge that needs to be built, in my experience, with the real world data sources, because they are not common place yet in the kind of work that is done. We've made lots of advances as an industry, and part of that, I believe, has also been greatly supported by regulators who have been open to talking about this data and finding the right place where this data can help with the understanding about certain disease states and people who live with different diseases, and where it fits into the clinical drug development process.
Mm. So one of the ways a lot of companies that I've talked to recently are now starting to think of data as a product. And what's driving them in that direction is, one, the thought that they want to make their data an asset. And in order to make it an asset, you really have to have somebody who owns it. So ownership becomes really important when you flip the switch and think of something as a product, and you have, quote, a product manager for data that's able to follow the data through its journey from the time it's generated or ingested all the way out to understanding the needs of the stakeholders and back. How do you feel that would impact real world data?
I agree with you. In many ways, this for real world data has been the model to date across the industry. When I would bring in a data asset or a data source that we purchase from an external vendor or another organization, there is an opportunity to assemble a group of experts that would dive into and understand the data quality, understand where to house the data, understand enough about the limitations of the data.
Mm-hmm.
And that element is incredibly important, as is garnering stakeholder interest, understanding their needs to, even before you bring in a new data source, to understand that the data source you're bringing in will actually be able to address the questions that they have. It really, the part around, I think, data governance is also incredibly important. This opportunity to think about what and how do we make this data findable,
Mm-hmm.
so that other people within a organization, if you think about how big, for example, a pharma company may be, you can't get to everyone just by speaking to them. So making the data findable is important. Maybe the FAIR principles perhaps are really the ones I can lean into here. The findability of this data, which means you would have metadata around the data sources that you bring in, and otherwise. The ability then to access the data for a specific business need, for a specific purpose, as opposed to an all-comers access.
Mm-hmm.
There's different kinds of centralized and decentralized models that can be adopted for access. Then there are topics around the interoperability, and maybe either a question of how do different data products interact with each other, or interact with any new data that may be collected, or inform any new data collection, or interact and integrate with existing already collected data.
Right.
And then the reusability, of course, right? From my perspective, there's the governance around access to the data, but then there's also a great opportunity for us to become people within our own respective organizations that are contributing to this concept of a learning, right? We talk about a learning health system, but also a learning organization where you're able to share maybe code that has been used to generate a specific cohort from this real world data source, and any insights that were generated. And that becomes part of the lineage of things that are associated with this data source, that makes it richer, that makes the future reuse even more informed when other stakeholders, data scientists, come to explore the data.
Yeah, I love the word rich, to enrich. Again, as data is used over and over again, it actually does get enriched, and it gets more and more valuable with use. So if we follow a value chain from the time data is either generated or ingested all the way through a data supply chain, and you end up at data reuse. And it's almost like how Google uses the references to websites to put together its AdWord rankings. In a way, it's very similar to that. The data that gets the most use usually is the most relevant and important data set in an organization, and being able to track the usage now really treats data as a valuable asset that it is throughout its, life cycle. I guess my last question for you is, what recommendations, people who are using and wanting to use real world data, what advice would you give them from your experience?
It's hard to pick just one, but maybe the part that I think is most impactful is around the people, the culture, the change management, and the opportunity that can bring to have successful adoption of our ability to explore and potentially, in the appropriate situations, even integrate insights about from real world data into some clinical drug development that is happening. And this is from the perspective of making sure that we understand as researchers the question that we're asking. These days, anyone can download a software, they can scrape the web or download a data set, they can do an analysis. And that can sort of democratization of those skill sets can be incredibly empowering. But we must remember to think as well, right? And to really make sure that, you no longer do you need a computer budget, right, to go in. You can just do that analysis very locally, very quickly. But we need to understand the context, the business need that we're meeting. A data source in and of itself is just that. It just sits it. It has really no value. It is us as people, as researchers, as those who are trying to improve the lives of people with diseases around the world. We create value by taking this journey from data through information to get and generate these incredible insights. So we have to be very disciplined about what we're doing and understand, are we generating a hypothesis? Are we trying to validate a hypothesis? What is the appropriate scientific approach around that? We have to be very disciplined. Otherwise, there's going to be many insights that are there, and their reliability will be limited. Their reproducibility will be limited. So that would be a few of my suggestions.
Well, thank you so much for that incredible insight into real world data. I really thank you for being my guest today, and we'll look forward to continuing collaborating with you.
Thank you so much for having me, Stan.
To be part of more conversations like this, join us in Berlin, October 18th and 19th for BioIT World Europe. Save an additional 10% off your registration with the code PODCAST. For more information, visit www.bio-itworldeurope.com. If you enjoyed this conversation, we'd love for you to leave us a review and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for joining us.